Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. Jose Saramago, The History of the Siege of Lisbon, translated by Giovanni Pontiero. Charlene Elsby, The organisation is here to support you. Scott Bradfield, The History of Luminous Motion. A name I always find it hard to pronounce. Brohumil Hrabal, Czech writer. This is called I Served the King of England and was translated by Paul Wilson. Ottessa Moshfegh, Death in Her Hands. Some poetry. The Galloping Hour, French poems by Alejandra Pizarnik, an Argentinian author. So Spanish was her first language, but this is a collection of poems she wrote in when she was living in Paris. She wrote them in French, translated by Patricio Ferrari and Forrest Gander. And finally some non-fiction, The Book of Mutter by Kate Zambreno. So I'm going to start with the Jose Saramago. So this is, as the title suggests, about the Siege of Lisbon in 1147, when Lisbon was a Moorish city and it was won back by the Portuguese with the help of crusaders, who were basically bribed to delay their trip to the Holy Land to help win this battle. And with it is the start of the Portuguese nation. And this is told from the viewpoint of a proofreader who is proofreading a work of history, tracing the siege. And for some reason, right at the end, he inserts the word "not," that the Crusaders didn't join the Portuguese armies of the king. And eventually this is found out and he's expecting to be sacked, but the author of the history book was okay about it, and they were just going to put an errata message in the book, so that they withdrew all the printed copies and then reprinted it with this errata in it. So actually he's still in good stead, but the one thing the publishing house does is it appoints a woman to oversee the proofreaders, and there is a sparkle of attraction between the proofreader and this woman. They're both, I'd say, sort of nearing middle age. They're not young. And on the first meeting between them professionally, she has the only extant copy of his original printed up version of the book, because all the others were pulped, and she sort of pushes it across the table to him and says, I'd like you to go on and write the book as a work of speculative history or a novel that the Crusaders hadn't joined up with the Portuguese armies. And he's sort of reluctant to do that. But what he realises, apart from his attraction to her, is that he goes back into, when he goes back into the same Lisbon, only sort of, 1,000 years later, a millennium later, he sort of invests it with the properties back from that time in 1147. His imagination can't help do that. And indeed, the book starts, I think, in a really interesting way. I've read lots of books about translators and the effect they can have on the final text and how much it's changed from the original. But this is from the viewpoint of a proofreader. So he talks about a line in the text where the historian has written, a blind muezzin climbs up the stairs of the minaret to announce the daily prayers on the day that the siege starts. And this proofreader sort of says, well, that's a bit of a sort of gratuitous detail. How do we know that? The historian gives us nothing more, and then proceeds to riff brilliantly which perhaps gives him the idea that he could be a creative writer himself. He was brilliantly sort of filling out that detail about the muezzin being blind, the steps up to the minaret that are worn and he can't see and has to be accompanied by a younger person using their eyes, and all this. And it's a fantastic riff that very much put me in mind of the work of Laurent Binet, not only in that sort of ability to riff like in the Seventh Functional Language, but also as I say, the impact that a translator, or in this case a proofreader, has on the making of history, on the writing of history. That one word, by inserting not, has changed the whole book. But here his sort of riffing on this one line of connecting detail that the original historian has sort of thrown in, he's sort of shown it's not fit for purpose because there's no historical record of it, and it's not giving us any added fact and information. It's just a bit of colour, but he needn't have bothered because it's one sentence. It gives nothing. It yields nothing. Whereas the proofreader has sort of filled that out with his own sort of imaginings. And again, that's very much like Laurent Binet's HHHH, which is about the role of the historian in creating history, adding, adorning, embellishing history, just through the very act of producing that history, of writing it. So it starts off really well with this, as I say, with this sort of subversion of the production of history. But then it's sort of the rest of the book, and I think it falls off here, is sort of split between this proofreader and this woman and his alternate writing, or writing as a novel, of the siege of Lisbon. He makes things hard for himself because he's removed the Crusaders from the equation. So now the Portuguese have the same number of troops as the Moors inside Lisbon's city walls. And yet somehow they have to defeat them in a siege situation when they don't have overwhelming numbers. And in the same way, he's made it hard for him to get the woman in real life, because he's put both he and the woman in his novel, in the siege, their characters in the siege, where he takes the form of a powerful soldier, but still sort of one from the ranks, a common man. He has no sort of aristocratic status. And she is a concubine of a crusader, because there were 6 crusaders who did stay, to fight with these guys. And because she's a concubine of someone with sort of aristocratic status, she's sort of untouchable. So he has to solve within his text the problems of how do the Portuguese win the war, and he has to sort of, he's not a military expert. He only knows what he knows from reading and proofreading other books, other historical books. So he has to solve that problem of how they win the siege, because obviously 21st century Lisbon, in which he's writing, 20th century Lisbon, is not under Moorish control. It's under the Christian Portuguese control. And the other solution is, how does the man and the woman get together? And I felt all of this rather lost the sort of interesting questions that the first part of the book had set up. So I'm not to star off for that. I gave it 4 stars because it is still very well written, but it didn't quite hold my interest all the way through. But Saramago is also a great wordsmith. Let us suppose that a man has asked a woman, "Do you love me?" and she remains silent, simply looking at him, sphinx-like and distant, refusing to utter that no, that will destroy him, or that yes, which will destroy the both of them. So the guy can write. 4 stars. On to Charlene Elsby. The organisation is here to support you. Now, I've read 4 previous Elsby novels and liked them all, and they always involve a psychotic or a character or a person who has a sort of psychotic break with reality. This is different. This is about an organisational culture. This is about a group hive mind. And you get the sense when it opens that this is a world where corporate culture has clashed with employment rights and trade union power. And that at the start of this book, they've come to an agreement that sort of satisfies both, and yet really satisfies neither. So that there is a hierarchy, there is a management structure where the management levels are numbered from 1 to 9, and that the protagonist of this book is a 7, and answers to her superiors who are 9s, but is also supposedly the drudge work is carried out by 2s, and the work is, it seems to be, to process claims by academics for research grants. That's what it seems to be, and they have to field the queries of people who either have put in a bid or want to put in a bid but just need clarification on things. So there is this hierarchy of management, but on the other, equally, when they have appraisals, everybody comes out with the same appraisal, that their work is satisfactory, no more, no less. And that is sort of somehow embedded in a worker culture whereby, you're not set in competition with your fellow workers. You don't have the cut and thrust of who's going to get promoted. You do have that, but there's no clues to it because everyone is given the same grade for their performance. Promotions to higher levels are very few and far between, and indeed one does come up within this book. And that's pretty much it. Our protagonist goes slightly off script in a similar way to 1984 and Winston Smith and Julia, in that one of the queries from an academic is sort of coded sexualized, and they sort of have remote or virtual sex with a sort of great sword of Damocles hanging over her neck, that she'll be discovered, she'll be found out. And that is handled in quite an amusing way. I will say there's a lot of humour in this book. The funniest part of it, I think, is a number 2, i.e. very low level, sort of within the hierarchy, who is brilliant at basically shirking all his work, palming off his responsibilities, and getting superior status people such as her and other 7s to do his work for him. He sort of frames his request so ingeniously that he can't possibly do it, he needs them to do it. So he gets them to basically run around, and then he puts in for a promotion for this role of 7, which is obviously 5 grades of management above his current level, which should be an impossibility. So he is really funny how he manipulates everybody within this organisation, and in a way is the best thing about this book. I don't really want to spoil it other than to say things come to a head and she feels that she has to break away and leave the organisation, where suddenly her complete sort of vulnerability and the fact that she has no ties, no support system, because she lives on site, is paid the money, is fed on site, all these sorts of, all of that's gone with the moment she leaves. She effectively quits and leaves. And then we get into, this is where I won't spoil it, we get into a sort of theory as to what lies behind breaking away from the organisation. In that sense, it had vibes of Dave Eggers' The Circle. So it's good, it's entertaining, it's very short. I mean, you can sort of blaze through it. It's funny, but it was a bit meh. It's a bit sort of lacking in profundity, I felt, and not stuff that we haven't seen done before. I think Charlene Elsby probably will be going back to the psychotic individual in her next work. But still, 4 stars, because it's good fun. And on to Scott Bradfield, The History of Luminous Motion. So we have an 8-year-old narrator, which normally would get my hackles up, because narrators that age don't possess the language that befits literary fiction. But it's a curiosity of this book that this 8-year-old thinks and speaks, expresses himself of someone more than double that age. And I'll come back to that. And he and his mother have split from their father, and they have a transient existence where in their car, while she's driving from town to town within California, picking up men with whom they can stay the night, or actually be paid for it. He's not attending school, obviously, because he's on the move all the time. He's an autodidact. He's sat in the back seat reading these sort of textbooks and things and educating himself. but he's thriving not only on the closeness and the relationship with his mother, but the fact that they're in motion is why it's called while he's with his mother in motion, it's a luminous feeling. But for some reason, she meets someone who she calls Pedro, even though he's white Anglo-Saxon, he's not Hispanic, and decides to stop their sort of quixotic, peripatetic existence and set up house with this guy. So she's not in motion anymore. And that seems to sort of cause the 8-year-old problems, although he does find two friends who are slightly older than him, Rodney and Beatrice, and the three of them sort of get up into petty criminality and delinquency, which is what his mother has done. But now that she's stopped, she's no longer in motion, he's sort of picking up the baton, but he's not quite finding that sense of luminosity. His mother and Pedro have a really nice relationship, and Pedro seems to be very caring, but it's implied, it's never specifically stated, that this 8-year-old does something to drive a wedge between the mother and Pedro, maybe even kill Pedro or maim him, we're not quite sure. At which point the mother, instead of taking back to the car and getting them motion, she takes to her bed and is basically absolutely depressed, and this boy is left more and more to his own devices with his two friends. I will say that the character of Beatrice is the best thing about this book. She's hilarious. She's a sort of feminist, sort of intellectual, even though she can't be much older than he is, supposedly. But I find her very entertaining, and in a way, this is a book about themes such as capitalism, because she's virulently anti-capitalist. It's about criminality and drugs, and just this sort of sense of dislocation, really. The father sort of comes back into the picture, aware that his wife is really struggling, and offers to come back and sort of reunite the family unit, which neither the boy nor the mother seem terribly keen on, but that's exactly what he does. He is a successful entrepreneur, businessman. He has money, so money is no longer an issue, and he's going to take care of his wife. And again, the boy seems to see this as driving a wedge, getting between the mother and him, this sort of precious bond, and hatches a plan with his two friends, Rodney. Well, no, hatches a plan with Rodney, not with Beatrice, to basically, again, get rid of the dad, either remove him from the scene or kill him, which doesn't work. The plan fails, and the boy is arrested and is sent away for treatment. That's basically the plot. What's strongest about this book is the voice. I love the voice that Scott Bradfield gives this boy. However, that does clash with the notion of him being 8 years old and his friends being slightly older. I don't understand why Scott Bradfield took that decision. Why he very definitively says they're 8 years old. Because clearly they don't speak and think and express themselves like 8 years old. They express themselves like teenagers. So that did jar, even though I loved the voice. I couldn't accept it as an 8-year-old voice, so that did jar, and that did knock 1 star off for me. But I found it a thoroughly entertaining read, and as I say, the character of Beatrice is wonderfully entertaining. She's so harsh, she's so brutal in her sort of analysis of male-female relationships, of capitalism. Terrific stuff. 4 stars. And on to I Serve the King of England by Brohumil Hrabal, as I say, Czech writer. So this is about a busboy who's working his way up in the hotel and sort of entertainment industries, and is learning a lot from the maitre d's that he serves under. And it's all very sort of, it rollicks along. It's a sort of Bildungsroman sort of style, until we reach about halfway, when suddenly it takes a very dark turn, because this is Prague and this is the 30s This is the German annexation of Sudetenland and then eventually taking over of Czechoslovakia entirely. And our boy is taken up with a German woman. And we get some, quite dark stuff about the sort of German racial purity, how it meshes into their breeding program. Because he's Czech ethnically, he has to go through a screening system that he's worthy of siring with this German woman. It's dark, dark stuff. And then after the war, obviously his whole life has been turned upside down, and his wife is no more. And he continues, within his journey along, sort of within the hotel industry. And he himself is able to sort of be a manager, be an entrepreneur, set up a hotel himself, and that causes its own problems. So it's this flow of, this is good rollicking fun to begin with. Then we get this very dark, but I think the strongest part of the book during the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, and then back again on the sort of similar but not quite, fun but not quite as convincing trail of sort of post-war Czechoslovakia. It's called I Served the King of England because one of his maitre d's had the privilege of serving the King of England when he was at his hotel. And this maitre d' is able to spot exactly, as soon as someone walks through the room, where they're from and therefore what their taste in the restaurant or at the bar will be. And our boy is always putting up 20 crown bets that he's wrong, and this guy is always right. And our boy goes, "How do you know that?" And he goes, "Because I served the King of England." And our boy gets to serve Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia. So he sort of chip off the old block, and he then sort of, when people go, "God, how do you know that?" or similar challenge, he goes, "Because I served the Emperor of Ethiopia." So it's good fun, but I actually think the best bits were the dark bits in the middle. So 4 stars. And to Ottessa Moshfegh, Death in Her Hands. So I've only read Eileen by Moshfegh. I can't bring myself to read The Year of Rest and Relaxation because one thing I can't be doing is people taking drugs. I'm just so over that. But this intrigued me. I didn't know of its existence. Someone mentioned it and sort of said they felt it was her best book. And as I said, I'd never even heard of it, so I picked it up. And it's basically about a middle-aged widow, recently widowed. So she leaves the big city and buys a very remote place in the countryside by a lake. It's a sort of dream, almost a fantasy existence for her. But it is very lonely. It is very isolating. And she just lives there with her dog. And obviously, most of the things are about sort of going on walks with the dog, going into town once a week to get her supplies, which are very Spartan. She has a very self-restricted diet. She's not short of money, but she wants to sort of live this life of sort of purity. And then one day on a walk, she finds this note which is weighted down by 4 pebbles. So it's been deliberately left there. And it says something like, "The body of Magda has been murdered, but I did not do it." So naturally she's intrigued. And her sort of, because she's so isolated, her mind sort of goes into overdrive in sort of fantasy as to what, who was Magda. And she invents a whole life for this woman Magda, and what her relationships are, and was she known to her murderer. So she comes up with this sort of very rich sort of narrative really around this murder. We don't even know if it's happened because there's no sign of a body. She can't find any trace. She goes online into the library in the local town to try and find out who this Magda is, because Magda is not a very common name in this part of rural America. But there are no clues to be had, so she sort of invents it all herself. It gets more and more sort of embellished in her own mind what this is. And her nearest neighbours, when she drops in on them, are having a murder mystery weekend. So she wonders, oh, is it all just part of what their play acting thing, you know, that it was one of the clues? And then she goes, well, no, because it's a long way from their house. That's not right. And so gradually, without ever really resolving this murder mystery, it's a book about loss and grief and having her life suddenly so empty and filling it out with these, you know, a sort of surrogate daughter who's been murdered, just to give her mind something to latch onto, just to keep her busy and employed, even though it's sort of completely crazy. It's really well done. It's really well written. But at the end of the day, again, I didn't feel there was all that much to be taken away from it. It's an entertaining enough read. And I can see why the person on Twitter said it was her best book, in their opinion. But I'm still not convinced by Moshfegh. I don't want to read a historical fiction book, because I don't read historical fiction. I don't want to read my year of rest and relaxation. So I don't really know. I need to see what her next book's going to be to see if I'm interested in it. I mean, I liked Eileen, but I don't like characters who are just sort of suffused in self-abasement, as I felt Eileen was. She actually won me over against my own sort of antipathy towards characters who are sort of self-abasement. So I'm very undecided about Ottessa Moshfegh. She's a good writer, I'm not querying that whatsoever, but I need to see what her next book's about as to whether I'm going to read it or not, if that makes any sense. So I think I gave it 3 stars. Oh, the other thing to say about it is it so incredibly reminded me of Claudia Pinheiro, Elaine Knows, and some of her other books where she's talking about single women who were isolated. I prefer the Pinheiro to this, I have to say. I thought there was more meat to that book because of its treatment of someone with Parkinson's disease. But it so reminded me, you know, constantly throughout of Eleanor Knows. And onto some poetry. So the reason I wanted to pick up a book by Alejandra Pizarnik is because in my review of Cristina Rivera Garza's new novel, Death Takes Me, I say new, it's newly translated to English, I think it was written in 2008, because there, amongst the many things it's doing, and I'll post my link to my review, which was, I think, the last video I posted, the poetry of Alejandra Pizarnik plays a significant role within that book. And really, part of Garza's book is sort of an analysis of Pizarnik's poetry. It's that central to that novel, and I'd never come across Pizarnik. So I went onto Amazon, and there's not that much available because she died at 36 at her own hand. So there's not that huge amount published. But I settled on this, the Galloping Hour, French poems, which sort of retrospectively was a mistake because she's Argentinian, so her first language is Spanish. Not because it doesn't work in French, far from it. I just think it's not the best place to start. So she spent some years in Paris, home of all the artists in the obviously pre-war, pre-Second World War, but also post-Second World War. Very bohemian place. She mixed with them. She knew a lot of them. And the couple of years that she was there, she wrote 2 collections. She wrote a collection called Under Diana's Tree, which I've now ordered and should have been the place I started. It's not arrived yet because, again, it's hard to get hold of her poetry. But she also wrote this collection of poems in French. And now this is a work that has the French original on the right-hand page and the English translation on the left, which I always appreciate. I can read French, although I must admit with this book I didn't. The problem with this book is the poems in here are great, very interesting, but it's a very slight book. I mean, the whole book is 86 pages, of which a lot of it are her drawings, a lot of it are reproducing her handwritten versions of these poems and others, diary, journal entries. So it's very slight. There isn't actually that much poetry here, and that's the problem. Her prose poems that begin the collection are, I think, the strongest, But, you know, as I say, the whole thing was just a bit too slight for me, and I'm going to read Diana's Tree or Under Diana's Tree when it turns up. But I still give it 4 stars. I just think it's not great value for money. And finally, some non-fiction. So Kate Zambreno, Book of Mutter. This is Zambreno, who is one of my favourite non-fiction writers because she's so literary and so lyrical. And this, like her previous book that I read, which is something like the Book of Writing, something like that. Oh no, Write As Though You Mean It, I think it's called, or Write Until You're Dead, it's something like that. I'll post the link to my review of it. Very similarly, this is fragmentary in the sense that it's almost sort of full of maxims. She draws lots of different sources, one after the other, as I say, in the sort of fragmentary style. And this is an attempt to get to know her late mother, who was a woman who didn't really reveal herself to her in childhood. And indeed, this is what she says about her childhood, both her and her sister. Oh, but when I had her to myself, I didn't know I possessed such reservoirs of love. I lavished her with my love, all the love that I'd been storing up since my childhood, when my mother was a prickly, mysterious, sometimes affectionate, extremely formidable woman who preferred her time alone. This is when her mother is old and dying. I tried to mother her. I tried to mother her as she was not mothered. Now she had no choice. It had broken her. We had broken her. I massaged her chat body with lotion. I helped turn her, helped change her. I imagined myself Shirley MacLaine to my mother's Deborah Winger. Didn't everyone say she looked like Deborah Winger? The dark feathery hair, the sharp features, the reputation of being difficult. I demand a sign be posted on her door. Be careful, this patient is fragile. She bruises easily. We were never intimate, mother and children, while she was our mother. But Minez in the same ground meet by tunnelling, and when she became our child, the affection came. So you see that sort of fragmentary style. And I don't know if you can, how clearly you'll be able to see this, but the cover is a key image for the book. So this is a work of art by Louise Bourgeois, and it's a doll's house. So Bourgeois made lots of doll's houses with real. I mean, she really reproduced the houses that she lived in, but in miniature, in doll size. But all the furniture was carefully done and stuff. But above it is a guillotine. And this is sort of Bourgeois' work, and this sort of mode of sort of symbols is key to this book. One of several, but is key. Because you've got the childhood home, the doll's house that one grows up in, but the threat of the guillotine of a dysfunctional family that always hovers above it like Damocles' sword. It's a good time I mentioned that this video. And what Zambreno says is that it represents her own upbringing and childhood. But of course the bits of furniture that are uniquely made by Zambreno to reflect her own living quarters do not apply to Zambreno or any other person in the gallery observing this. So the generality you can relate to, but the specifics remain private and personal to Bourgeois, because the detail of the furniture and everything else in the house is unique to her living experience, cannot be shared, cannot be picked up. And it's sort of observations like that I just think are brilliant by Zambreno. As I say, one of my favourite non-fiction writers. So this is the last thing I'm going to read. The first time I returned to her gravesite, a couple years after her funeral, it happened to be around Memorial Day. I walked around the cemetery and took pictures of the objects left behind, the bouquets of flowers, the teddy bears, like a treacly gift shop for the dead. Oh, what a phrase. I read somewhere that the beautification of death movement began in the mid-18th century. Cherubs and cheerful poems were now placed on headstones, as opposed to what had adorned them the century before. Brackets, morbid poetry. Day-glow bouquets in the shape of crosses, garish planters in the shapes of lambs and swans dot the landscape, the detritus of the dead. Souvenir, French for to remember. To put these memories in a book, so as to be released from it. these 13 years of it like a sacrificial offering, to bury it in the ground, writing as a way not to remember but to forget, or if not to forget, to attempt to leave behind. All the offerings left for the dead, so they remain buried. And again, just to state that, you know, that's what I've just read, but you can see sort of there are gaps between as she's drawing in different sentiments, different emotions, different sources, different things she's quoting. And that is the structure throughout the book. I just think it's brilliant. It's a brilliant work on sort of, you know, trying to, as I say, disinter your mother, who remained a bit of an enigma all your life. 5 stars. And on to what I'm going to read next. So I'm going to read Alexis Wright, Australian Aborigine writer, Carpentera. I've owned this book for a while, and it was Sean from Travel Through Stories who has jogged me to pick this up and read next, because he's just done his 2024 best reads, and there is an Alexis Wright novel in there. It's not this one. But when he was talking about it, he said how this book, Carpentera, was in his top reads of the previous year, 2023. And as I happen to have it, so I'm really looking forward to this. This will be my next read. So until then, BookTube, thanks very much.